Hello and welcome to episode 23 of the AST podcast. We've got a pretty exciting episode today. We have Professor Rob Currie from the Schulich School of Law at Dalhousie, and Rob is going to be discussing Steve Bannon. Now, within the circles I tend to move in, academic circles, fairly liberal, fairly progressive, we tend not to like to use the word evil. And the exception, of course, would be Hitler. And the other exception, I think, is Steve Bannon. That people tend to see Steve Bannon as the embodiment of everything that's wrong in the world. At various stages today, I might try and contest that gently, because I do think he is very wrong on pretty much everything. But we want to set this conversation against the backdrop of A, who Steve Bannon is, and two, why one might be extremely worried about him. And so to set that up, Professor Rob Currie from the Schulich School of Law at Dalhousie University is going to start us off by telling us who is Steve Bannon.
Sure, delighted. And it's difficult even to come up with the right label. As you say, the devil would be one in some circles. Looking back at his background, you see things like investment executive. He was with Goldman Sachs for a few years. Certainly a media figure, maybe a public media intellectual rabble-rouser.
Right.
Even that is too flattering for him in some circles, but I think begins to capture what he's been up to. These days, he's seen as more of a social influencer, I think, and even a social movement creator and facilitator. I think most of your viewers will know him primarily as the figure who stood behind the throne in the early days of the Trump administration, was Trump's chief advisor, or among his chief advisors, ran key aspects of the campaign, and is widely credited with having gotten Trump elected president. So that's, and those are his, devilish bona fides in the minds of some. He moved on from the Trump administration, or was moved on, depending on what version you believe. And lately, he's really emerged as a self-styled intellectual movement generator. And in particular, he's got an idea that is, puts himself at the forefront of a movement that is anti-globalist, whatever that means, and we'll talk a bit about that. Anti-liberal intellectual, certainly very much. You hear the phrase national populism or nationalist populism thrown around a lot with regard to Bannon. And he's an enigmatic figure, because I think he moves in intellectual circles, and yet he's not considered an intellectual by intellectuals, which is quite interesting. But he's having a manifestly profound effect on the social dialogue, both here in North America, certainly in the West. Again, however that is that's cast, and his recent activities, which we'll get into talk about, are looking to up the ante in unexpected ways, including within the scope of his Catholic identity.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we had to plot a map, I think some of the key highlights of his journey would include his involvement with the Brexit campaign via Nigel Farage, who again is up there in the odious mistakes. Then he brings that energy and those ideas to the Trump campaign. The Trump campaign, I think, and maybe different opinions on this, but I think that that Trump evolved a platform, and elements of this platform would come from his daughter and his son-in-law, who would be, I think, reasonably moderate, relative to Bannon, and then an ideology coming from Bannon which says build on white working class feelings of alienation and discontent, identify evil enemies in terms of immigrants, in terms of Islam, and just ramp up these elements, as happened at Brexit, and you can win with that. And then he is active with, and to be honest, he's just as, I think, influential on Salvini's populist movement in Italy, and the the Gilets Jaunes campaign in France, he's in dialogue with many of these guys. And so, it almost reminds me of a kind of, an old cop show that had sort of a big massive chart and all these intersecting little lines for a mafia hierarchy or something. And there at the middle of almost everything is this guy, Steve Bannon.
Yeah, all these spidery lines.
Exactly, yeah. And they all seem to go through him. And of course, early on, he was with Breitbart. He was the linchpin of Breitbart. And so he's come to popular attention again. He's never too far away from popular attention. But he came to popular attention again this week with stories that featured in National Catholic Reporter, Globe and Mail, CNN, and I noticed yesterday on La Civita Cattolica. Tell us about that story and why it's scary.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So the reportage is that he, among his various activities, sort of pushing the nationalist populist agenda, he has decided that Pope Francis is the enemy of somebody, of the people in some way. And has allied himself with conservative elements of the church, and has identified, I'm going to sort of parenthetically go off here, has identified an interesting thing, which is that media attention is focused on internal Vatican squabbles like no other time in our history that I can think of, at least in relative terms. And Bannon, you go back to Breitbart, like Bannon, it's all about media, it's all about communication at that surface level, at the, the largest mass level possible. So having seen fissure lines there, he seems to have aligned himself with certain conservative elements, or what are styled conservative elements, and has rented an old monastery in Italy, sort of in a remote area, where he will train a new cadre of nationalist populists with the stated objective of reversing, reverse engineering what the church has been doing under Pope Francis. Quite openly hostile to the Pope and his organization, apparently, and I'm drawing this from very credible media sources who would have fact-checked it. Cardinal Raymond Burke is the honorary president of this organization, still somewhat shadowy organization that he's created. And so there's what's scary sounding about it, and I don't want to be too alarmist, but what's scary sounding about it is this idea of a school for proto-fascists who will then go out and be influencers in Europe. And as you've quite correctly averred to his influence and his role in various European movements, and the resurgence of nationalist far-right authoritarian kind of thinking. So that sounds scary to me. And it's Burke's role, I think, that has really bothered me, because it's one thing when, as Catholics, our internal conflicts are just that, are internal. Entirely another thing, I think, for a cardinal to ally himself in any way to someone like Bannon in particular, to any outside influencer, but to Bannon, and to really air the dirty laundry and bring the bloodiness of the internal conflict out, where it seems to me it'll undermine the church even more.
Right. So to buy a monastery in Italy, which sounds like a wonderful idea, I'd love to do that, but it's going to cost a lot of money. How can Bannon afford such a thing?
I gather it's more of a lease arrangement than a bought thing. And I think the initial reports were saying Bannon bought a monastery, but for some of the reporting I've seen suggests he's leasing it. And there are leasehold improvements being made. He's converting the monk cells into guest rooms. He needs to bring Wi-Fi in there somehow, which again will be a challenge in the sound of things. The reporters who were there saying, I can hardly even get a cell phone signal here because it's in a remote sort of area in northern Italy. So funding, I gather, will come from elements that have funded the rest of his other organizations. It seems a bit mysterious, truth be told. I'm sure a sort of subscription fee, like a literal payment for service sort of fee. But the funding arrangements at this point, at least to me, are still a bit shadowy. You
have far too much knowledge and information about this. What I was hoping you'd say was Bannon is funded by an awful lot of extremely wealthy far-right businessmen making mistakes, which is true, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
So So there are, in the same way that people on the right accuse the left of having Soros money and things like that, there are far-right businessmen in the United States who are funding these kinds of activities all over Europe and pushing a particular ideology. Tell us a little bit about that ideology. What are the core components of, and again, obviously, if something is going to have potency in Italy, in France, in Turkey, in Russia, in the United States of America, and apparently, again, I don't want to link Jordan Peterson and Steve Bannon, although there's some stuff, but apparently I saw some figures recently about where Jordan Peterson's YouTube channel is watched most, and India is just massive. And so,
I didn't know.
Yeah, and so if something is going to catch the mood, particularly I think of young men, seems to be in these places, it's going to be diverse and it's going to be contradictions and a whole host of stuff. But what can you tell our audience about the core, just the chorus, the core kind of rhetoric that tends to be found within Bannonite populist nationalist movements?
Well, I'll preface it by saying I'm just an ordinary law professor, and I'm not an expert in these areas at all. But I'm interested, and I've studied in my past lives nationalistic type movements in particular. Right. So, with that caveat, it's a big tent for the disaffected.
Right.
Really, and well, again, we can trace that back to Breitbart, which really, I think, tapped into anger at social dislocation that was felt by certainly a disparate number of groups, but tend to be unified in the sense that they emerge from strata of society that used to be on top and now aren't on top anymore. Okay. And Jordan Peterson's a great example of that. He would come alongside. Because Peterson's unique genius, and I say this quite sincerely, is that he has tapped into the confusion among young men in North America and in Italy and Western Europe about the way social roles are changing, the way social mores are changing, and there is some fluidity around what a man's role in society is, and it is confusing, it's disconcerting, and that tension line is what Peterson put his finger on. So Bannon and allied people and organizations have put their finger on the same kind of line, except it's economic dislocation by people who fancied themselves, the hard-working bedrock supporters of, the social fabric of America and of other places. So much of his energy is focused on America. So it's an umbrella that welcomes all angry people. And within that, so as you said, you get a bunch of different streams of rhetoric which don't always, mesh very well or make sense necessarily. There is a strong stream of what's often referred to as anti-globalism. Now, globalism, I can't help but jump in with my opinion. Right? This is someone needs to say the emperor has no clothes. It doesn't actually mean anything. Right. I think what it frames is suspicion that a mysterious they are taking things from me because my economic situation is not as good as it used to be. So that's, I think, from my own, sort of interest in it, that's the strongest theme that I see. And with other outgrowths like nationalism, like ourselves and others, and there's an anti-immigration aspect of that. Yeah. So you see a great deal of that. Certainly suspicion of the United Nations. Suspicion, and just to pull out the 10,000 feet, suspicion of the entire post-World War II liberal internationalist project, which of course was designed to prevent another bloody war. Like, the European Union, what's Brexit? Brexit's about reaction to the European Union and undermining it. Europe has enjoyed the greatest period of peace it has ever had since the Peace of Westphalia, since hundreds of years before as nation states began to come together. That was just a cauldron of warlike peoples. Yes. And that project arose in the post-World War II era, designed to do exactly that. to try to keep under control the social forces that gave rise to both of the world wars in the 20th century. And that's what's under attack, I think. So many would say, and I think I would put myself in that camp.
Right. Excellent. I think pretty much 99% of my brain agrees with that 100%. There is a 1% part of my brain which delights in iconoclasm, right? And it's actually a vice rather than an intellectual virtue.
Well, you can go to confession later.
Exactly. And that part of me wants to, and it's probably the reason why I have probably watched pretty much every Steve Bannon interview that he's given, and I'm trying to understand some of these forces in a way that I'm not getting from the media that I read. And so, in terms of what you said, very eloquently, very coherently, that is the perspective that I find when I read newspapers, when I speak to people. I am, however, suspicious of some of the things that Bannon is critical of. And what that is the subjugation of the working classes by the privileged, and to use Marx's terminology, the superstructure that has emerged to maintain this subjugation. And so for Karl Marx, you have economic conflict between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, and the bourgeoisie evolve the arts, the media, sport, and a whole host of other things, religion, which serves to maintain this power structure. I think that working class people all over the West, and I'm sure elsewhere, are demonized to a large extent by those of us with power, you and I, and many others. And we do this by saying that the problems in the world are primarily caused by these wicked working class people, because these wicked working class people are the racists. And so we would say to someone who is campaigning for racial justice, I agree with you 100%. I am championing your cause. And in so doing, we will elevate ourselves and give ourselves more access to resources and more power within our social strata. And we'll say, but the reason why it's not happening is because there are people in the South who are bad. And so we'll demonize them. These are the people who shop at Walmart, and we will assail them for doing so, and they will not be environmentally solid, and we'll assail them for this, and they won't eat properly, and they'll smoke, and they'll do all these things that we will demonize. And also we will tell them to be welcoming of immigration and a whole host of other things. And again, when we tell them that, we rise, we elevate. People think that we're wonderful, and people will come and listen to us speak, and people will give us grants, all the rest of it. But these people who are coming are not going to compete with my taxi job. They're not going to compete with my job on a factory floor. They're not going to elevate the price of houses in my particular neighborhood. And so it's a luxury I have. So too, you think of young males. I will champion feminist perspectives, and in so doing elevate myself, while throwing these young males who are the baddies under the bus. And so part of the reason I wonder for this massive discontent that you suggest that it is people who used to have power no longer have power. It is people who are confused about shifting social relations. And I wonder, I was actually watching, I was forcing my kids to watch rather than watching Quo Vadis over the weekend. And Deborah Kerr this is in 1950 something, and she is having a set to with this Roman centurion who says women aren't supposed to think, they're supposed to look pretty and all the rest of it, and she's given loads of it, and this is a kind of a woke perspective in the 1950s. You know? And so I wonder if these social things have changed all that much. And I wonder if, because part of the reason I think that Peterson is popular is because his location on the autism spectrum, because I think he does have some issues there, but that gives him great insights because he doesn't pick up on social cues, and he asks, really? And some of the things he's asking, and so we assume all these things. We assume that if there are less women than men in CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, this means misogyny, this means patriarchy. And part of his attraction is that he goes, well, wait, does it? And all of a sudden, people, oh, holy shit, let's look at that. And that's, I think, liberating because he doesn't simply assume the social cues, whereby someone like me would go, of course, absolutely, I'm not going to question that, because if I question that, I'll lose social power. People will think I'm a misogynist, I'll be alienated from my social group, and I've evolved as a Darwinian creature to not want that. You know, Peterson doesn't. You know, and so he asks these questions. So what I'm wondering is, when Bannon is hypercritical of the society, the world that we've built, certainly since World War II, but I would even suggest since the French Revolution, when Bannon is highly critical of this world, is he not correct to identify that this world has been perennially violent towards the working class, and that these working class people, for various reasons, know it's wrong and want change? They're not entirely clear what that change should look like, but they want change. And so I think that Bannon, in riling up nationalism, riling up xenophobia, and all that, is doing horrific things. But I think he is correct to identify the violence which is endemic in the world that we've created, which has been created to support us, to keep us in our privileged place, and to keep us in the privileged place on the backs of working class people who we are demonizing and who are now saying, screw you. You know?
Well, I think he's done that brilliantly. And the funny thing is, and this would be my own view, he stands in front of the edifice that has been built in society that oppresses those very people and points the finger away from it.
Okay.
And harnesses the fact that people know enough to be angry. They know enough to know when they're being exploited. The complexity of society having grown in the last 60 or 70 years to an incredible amount, it's difficult for anybody to figure out the various streams of power structures and so on. Bannon's idea, I think, is to see the coming revolution in a Marxian sense and say, we need to protect ourselves. And he's doing it by demonizing the entire superstructure of national and international institution building that was done to prevent exactly that, to try to direct us in a more positive direction with more social equity, with a social safety net. And I'm moving towards the word socialism, which is now being debated hotly in the U.S. Funnily enough. It's funny that he's found the angry people and articulated for them a vision of what they're angry about.
Right.
But what they're angry about, actually, it's not you and I, effete intellectuals in a Western city who are oppressing the working class. It's the Koch brothers. It's the people who are actually funding Bannon and his movement. It's that, desire for unfettered capitalism and concentration of money and power. That's what's kept the hillbilly elegy types, down.
That's where I disagree with you. I think that the capital has only ever been a signifier of power. It hasn't been power itself. And while certainly the structures of capitalism, Koch brothers and people like that, while they certainly are guilty of withholding capital, the real denigration and brutalization of the working classes is, to my mind, a denigration or brutalization of their power. It is the demonization of them, the ridiculing of them, which we have been involved in for quite some time. If you think of the movie Deliverance, which is sort of identifies them as the evil other. If you think of The Simpsons, if we think of Jon Stewart or Trevor Noah, these people, their accents, the clothes they wear, you think of websites like People of Walmart. What you have is an awareness that these people are being squished down in terms of power, and it is we, the woke, the righteous, who are not simply doing the squishing, but we are saying that they deserve to be squished because they are immoral, because they don't think like we do. And so I think that one of the mistakes that Marx made was that Marx, and he didn't fully make it. So there's a fascinating line that Slavoj Žižek constantly notes, where Marx hints at the fact that a commodity has a kind of a mystical power, But most of the time he's focused on capital, and I think this is the case, that is sort of that there is. That you have that line in Scarface, Brian De Palma's version of it, where Al Pacino's buddy says, first we get the drugs, then we get the money, then we get the women. And so it's breaking capitalism down into a very, very Darwinian thing, that ultimately the goal is that I will maximize my opportunity for genetic replication. And we don't think that way. We just think I want power to be, and it's those things that it's in those ways that we subjugate the. What I'm trying to make is that within the world of Facebook and Twitter, within the world of Comedy Central television, we identify social stratification along lines other than financial, and within this new world, the working class are demonized by, not necessarily by the Koch brothers, but by television, media, the New York Times, and all of us who say who hold that they are stupid and they are wicked, they are uneducated, they are morally bankrupt, and they are raging at us. They're raging at us, and I think part of that rage is justified. And I think that the society that we have built to maintain our positions of privilege and power, I think this world is coming to an end in the next 100 years. And one of my fears is, exactly as you said, that it will be Bannon-style vision which will return to the fore. And I think the only way to stop that is by genuinely bringing about real change in our social orders, which will move away from that, and so it's an identification of the baddies, and what we do is that we will identify the baddies as the 1%, who own 99% of the resources, and they're the baddies, and I wonder if, when working class people are pointing out the baddies, they're not thinking of all those people who will say that, we're the baddies, we're the racist ones, we're the xenophobic ones, we're the misogynist ones. Because we make careers out of blaming them and say that they need to be educated in our camps of education, which will rise up. And so I'm just wondering whether, I guess, sort of that while Bannon is right to, so your point is, and I think it's a very, very good point, is that Bannon identifies the anger, but he manages to move the anger away from the 1%, where the anger should go. And I'm saying that he identifies the anger, but some of the anger that he identifies is legitimate, and that and I think when he uses the word globalist, he is thinking about the unified mindset that would be typical of the average person in Google, Microsoft, Apple, New York Times, CNN, Harvard, Yale, McGill, Dalhousie, Pick a person up and ask them their values, ask them what they think about same-sex unions, what they think about religious diversity, what they think about any of these things. They will be largely monolithic in what they express and the values they identify. And the people who are the baddies are, yes, that 1%, but it's also these vast swathes of working class people who are being demonized, So let's, and you disagree with that?
I disagree with some of it. I think, insofar as part of our demonization, as you put it, of the lower substratum, the economically disadvantaged and their bad attitudes, their backward attitudes, comes from a place of the great 20th century experiment, which is social engineering. And being able to say, we're never going to be entirely objective here, but there are things we can know. Like, there is data that we can access. So when Bannon whips up anti-immigrant sentiment, Bannon and his types, for example, I can access data. Immigrants, in fact, are not competing with them for jobs. They're not distorting the economy. They're not, with the exception of Chinese investors out west, they're not driving up, housing prices. They are benefiting the economy to a great extent. We can look at that data. We can harness that and say that is a falsehood being told to you. You know who's killing you? McDonald's is killing you. Coke brands are killing you. The way the economy is being structured so as to shelter capital from taxation, so as to concentrate the benefits of free trade, in tax shelters and in the hands of the 1%. We can say that objectively. It's difficult to say that in a way to somebody without telling them that they're wrong. And when you're told you're wrong, you're resentful. Naturally, anybody would be resentful. And then what we've got now, and Bannon and his types have harnessed this, is the power of social media. So it's one thing if, if 5 of us are sitting around the table at Tim Hortons debating these issues and telling each other that we're wrong. But on Facebook, you might end up with, what they're calling the echo chamber effect of 500 other people who all resent the same sorts of things, and you all tell each other you're right. And that has a magnifying effect that's further distorting public relations and social relations, and it magnifies the anger that Bannon, as representative of all that is evil, can tap into.
Yeah.
Right? So there are massive distortions of a kind I would never say that we understand. I certainly don't understand them. But it's complex.
If we have that data, and it came from the North Korean school of North Korean paradigms, we go, I'm not sure. The Bannonites, are looking at that data and going, they don't trust the universities, and perhaps there are reasons not to trust the universities. They know that if it were the case that the truths of our social liberalism were not the case, if it were the case, we couldn't get anything published to say that. No one. Let's say, for example, there was data to show that all Irish people are inherently prone towards drunkenness and disorder, right? You're not going to get that published. That's not going to be published anywhere, and you're not going to get funding for it, and so your research will be siphoned into areas which which echo the dominant paradigm, and you will be encouraged, if you want a career, to think and write and act in a certain way.
Well, there are sacred cows. There's a set of them.
Yeah, and so because of what we've become, so again, you have faith, and I think much of it is really warranted, in the kind of world that we've built since the Second World War, and there are good reasons why we've built this world. But we have inadvertently become a hegemonic, even totalitarian regime ourselves within the universities, which we take in students of fairly diverse perspectives and we funnel them into our perspective. A friend of mine recently, and this is a bizarre example, and I'm not defending where this guy was coming from, but he's a professor, and this Islamic student kind of looks up to him as a fellow Muslim, and talks to him and so on and so forth. And the student was taking a course in medieval history and was enjoying it greatly, but he got ripped apart in an essay because he was suggesting that one of the key reasons for Saladin's victory at the Battle of Acre was because it was the will of Allah. Now, his professor was, and I get this, his professor was saying, you can't say that. That's not what we do here. In order for you to pass this course, you have to think like us and not think like you. And therefore that reason that you're given can't be given. And so the student had a problem because he firmly believed that the will of Allah was a contributory factor to Saladin's victory at the Battle of Acre. And yet he would fail the paper if he included that among the reasons what to do. And this again is just a simple example, and that example that we'd all probably on the professor's side, for how we will refuse alternative perspectives. And we talk about the echo chamber on the far right. We are the most echoey of all.
I can't disagree with that.
Of all chambers. And so, is it possibly the case that while The Guardian, the New York Times, CNN, all our universities, all our right-thinking people, while our natural response is to say, Steve Bannon, there's his horns, there's his tail, kill this man, not literally, but metaphorically. We should be saying that if we want to avoid the horror of a future which looks like he would have it, we need to help create a future which is different from us. And so there is a massive need to reform, and I don't see the left as being capable of producing that reform. What we do, and what we've done really, I think, since the French Revolution, is to identify an oppressors and an oppressed, and they'll keep bouncing around, and we'll just keep on sort of putting our finger in the dam of oppression. This week it's these people, this week it's these people, this week it's these people, while all the while making sure that nothing changes. And the whole ideology could simply be seen as a device for ensuring that nothing changes when we retain the kind of power, not consciously, but subconsciously because of what we've evolved as.
I think maybe I would question whether you're overstating. I totally buy into your critiques of the echo chamber of academia, and the for want of a better word, liberal bias that exists among us. But the way that university culture and academic intellectualism has evolved, I think, has been to create a pocket of people who are actually opposed to social power structures. Because where are you going to find the most radical kind of thought that we would need to actually change the economic power structures in society? You're not going to find it in government. You're not going to find it in right-wing think tanks like the Fraser Institute. You're going to find it in the university structure, which is meant to be a big playground for ideas, and we permit and tolerate and encourage a certain amount of wackiness. so that we can generate best solutions. And I recognize and I totally accept there is an ideological totalitarianism that pops up and evolves. But it often is in reaction to existing power structures.
Right.
So you can't, the example you gave of the student writing the paper and wanting to incorporate a religious worldview and perspective in there. There is definitely an anti-religion streak in academia, but of course it's in reaction to the institutional power that not just our church, but that the various churches had in the world, and was seen quite properly as ultimately corrupt and ultimately unaccountable and causing untold harm. And I mean the institutional structures, not the actual underlying faith systems, right? But the institutional structures causing harm to society. So,
yeah, but I think that one of the things we've done is validate our social order with reference to mythologies which people like Jordan Peterson are questioning. I think that's one of the reasons why he's so popular. He simply says, well, is this the case? And in relation to the malevolent power of the church, I think that's some of the uncontested mythologies, that I think if we look deeper, we certainly can't absolve the church of various horrors that it's been participant in. But I think we'll find that we have massively overplayed it. We shouldn't forget that, in the 19th century, we had periods where in some of the world's largest democracies, France, which may not have had democracy for very, very long in the early part, but Christianity was criminalized. It was, like it was in the factory. We think of the giants of university life over the last 200 years, and most of them are rabidly, think of Freud, Nietzsche, Marx, like the great figures are rabidly anti-religious. And so we wonder, when was this period in which the church did wield this kind of influence? And perhaps part of the influence it wielded was not as the church, as a Machiavellian body, but simply as this is right thinking. It is right thinking such that people who think this, who are not patriotic, for example, are bad people. And right now, without the church, we have similar hegemonies of right thinking. And if anyone disputes this, they are going to be, so the McCarthyism of the past is not of the past. The tropes are different. There's no Joe McCarthy and it's not communism, but it's the exact same kind of thing. That's what we do, and we justify ourselves and we don't change because you said, oh, we did that because of these people, or we did that because of this, we did that because of this. And so we constantly, it's like whack-a-mole, so we constantly hit this in the head, this in the head, this in the head, while ensuring all the time that, that nothing changes. I think that, that what we're seeing, last week we had a pay-per-view debate between Jordan Peterson and Slavoj Žižek. And the fact alone that this was pay-per-view online fascinates me. Because while I disagree with both of them, although I agree with a lot of what Žižek says, but while I disagree with both of them, these are the two most influential thinkers in the world today. And both of them are radically opposed to the liberal status quo that represents most university life, most newspaper life, most media life, most big business life. And so what this tells me is that all these young people, some in the university, some outside the universities, are seeking something different. And that we tend to not be providing that for them. Both of them are savage critics, no less savage than than Bannon, of liberal quote unquote globalism, whatever that looks like. Now, Žižek from a fairly Marxist perspective, Peterson from some kind of lobster perspective.
It's very difficult to pick them
down. But I think that and so I'm just wondering, and this podcast that has sort of emerged from our rightful fear of Bannon, and I wonder if that fear itself can shield us from a willingness to look at the massive structural problems and cultural problems within our dominant institutions and seek to actually change them. Because when we think about change, we constantly speak about change in ways that won't affect us. We need the top 1% to pay more tax, that doesn't affect me, and we need the bottom 1% to stop being as racist and be more environmentally sad, that doesn't affect me, And so we constantly play this game, which in fact sort of keeps us where we are. Yeah. And again, we tell these mythological stories. The big stories we speak about is the story of that anyone can do it, that within our society we all have equal access to capital, which we know is a myth, and that's why we hold up these isolated examples, and we have these religious rituals like America's Got Talent, Canada's Next Top Model or whatever, where we see one person make it to the top, and then these sort of liturgies almost support our entire social order because look, anyone can do it. And then this person will say, well, I learned that you work hard enough, anyone can do it, and then they reinforce the mythos, But it's largely illusory, because for every 10,000 people in South Central LA, one of them is going to make it as a ball player, as an artist. And we think that therefore this shows that our social order is working, So I'm wondering about I think that definitely we need to say the way Peterson is speaking about a new future, dodgy. The way Zizek speaks about a new future, ultimately, he wouldn't be too averse to violent socialist revolution. And so, okay, maybe there's certain parts there we can't go with. The way Peterson speaks about it, definitely problematic. But we can't, I don't think, maintain the social order that we've built. And so the question becomes, what then is the future? And someone could say, and I apologize for being so late in bringing this back in, and I want you to speak a little bit about this. But someone could say, Cardinal Burke, that modern liberalism, has been the counter religion that the church has opposed for centuries. We think of the Syllabus of Errors, we think about First Vatican Council, all this sort of stuff, and that's what he's getting behind. A theological alternative to modern liberalism. But you quite rightly are wary of that and are wary of this infiltration of Bannonite ideology into the very bowels of the church.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, and there's a lot to unpack there. And my own view, as you know, is that as far as the church goes, things went wrong when Constantine made it the official religion of the state. Right. And the church's embeddedness in the state is what's created problems of all sorts.
Yeah.
So to say that the church has been fighting modernism, it's been fighting it from a power structure essentially, and that has changed greatly in certainly in the 20th century. Mm-hmm. I think where I part company with Cardinal Burke would be to say, I'm not entirely sure that the power structure that the church invested in sufficiently supports Christ's goals.
Right.
So we can. I like the idea of iconoclasm. I like there being a Jordan Peterson, even if he drives me nuts. We always need to be questioning social structures, but the kind of liberal intellectual culture that you're speaking of arose out of oppression. It arose as a reaction to oppression. And conveniently enough, it was universities and broader access to university education that even gave rise to the idea of oppression among generations of people who could actually read Marx and could think about it and could say, well, I can apply some of these ideas. So Jordan Peterson originally came to light. This is just as an example. He came to light because he got cranky about the idea, the ill-founded idea, that he could go to jail if he refused to use people's pronouns.
Yeah.
And we know the sort of trends around pronouns and homosexuality.
Yeah.
Now, I've always said that it was really the blind leading the blind, because Peterson didn't understand Ontario's human rights code. Neither did his critics, frankly. There's a lot of terrible, ill-informed rhetoric on both sides. But what's going on there is there's a social evolution that responded to oppression, that people were oppressed for being different in whatever sense they were being different. And we're to move the topic slightly. The church now, for example, has evolved to a point where if you talk to any reasonably educated Catholic, with awareness of what's happening, they'll say, okay, as far as we know, God made gay people the way they are, and they are the way they are, and we are to love them, and they are, and then then there's a dialogue about, okay, how do you live your life within a scriptural context if you happen to be gay? That's a very recent development, right? I mean, the way society is living with gender and sexuality constructs now, again, is a reaction to millennia of oppression of people based on what we now know primarily are their biological characteristics. Mm-hmm. So where there's this crucible of ideas that are reactions to oppression, ever doth the pendulum swing. Right. We're at a funny point now where there is an ideological totalitarianism. Right. I think where I would come back to, though, is, boy, it's a lot better than the actual kind of totalitarianism that we've seen in living memory, and that Bannon is moving us back towards. Right. We know all about nationalism. We know far too much about it. And we all know about harnessing the ideas of angry people, or harnessing angry people with ideas, whatever the best way to put it is. Yeah. So, we can dance around the head of a fairly small nail about language policing and social trends and what you can and can't say in a university undergrad paper, and yet Stalin and Hitler and all of that. I don't think it is too early to sound the alarm with those social forces based on our endless capacity to repeat the mistakes of the past.
Right. I agree with you 100%. Is it possible that, so Bannon obviously hasn't suggested that we have Stalinist purges or anything like that, but we're frightened of him because we've heard this tune before and we know what the chorus sounds like, and so we are wary of that. Bannon, however, sees the soft totalitarianism that you have correctly identified is infinitely less problematic than actual totalitarianism. But he and his kind wonder where this will lead. I think they correctly identified that people now who don't think on message can be sacked and are being sacked. Right now, we've seen it at Google, we've seen it in sporting organisations. I don't know if you've been following the Israel Folau. We're getting so many hot button topics in this. Israel Folau, Australian rugby union player, who is a religious fundamentalist from some kind of what's called oneness Pentecostal. And so he thinks you're going to hell as a Catholic. He thinks I'm going to hell as a Catholic. He thinks gay people are going to hell. He thinks thieves, drunkards, liars, gamblers, big massive swathe of people are going to hell. That's his belief. He's a oneness Pentecostal. But he was sacked from playing rugby for Australia because of that, because for expressing that belief. Now again, it wasn't his first crime. He had said something similar a year ago and maybe got a warning then or whatever. And people who clicked like, other rugby players who clicked like on his tweet haven't yet been sacked, but there's currently tribunals going. And of course, Izzy Folau is going to hire lawyers, and there's going to be a whole host of things like that, and so it'll play out. But their fear is that if our soft, gentle, progressive happy totalitarianism leads to firings now, where will it lead to? You know, we think of Leninist-style re-education camps. Well, whenever we say that these people are undereducated and that's why they think these bad things, how close are we to saying they need to actually be educated? And where will we send them? And it won't be Siberia, but maybe it'll be Brampton, you know, where we will have an education camp. And of course, you know, our opportunities for social advancement will be limited. And so they have fears, I think, and I think you're 100% right that these are the natural pendulum swings. And so all I'm saying is, I agree with you 100%. But in addition to fighting head-on the demon Bannon and these demonic forces, we also need to quietly, maybe off camera, tweak our own totalitarian tendencies, you know, and a sort of and soften them a wee bit, you know. Where we can't do that, or where we certainly as lay people, is in the church, and you're seeing that the opposition to the church by the far right. I'm thinking here about and don't click these links, boys and girls, because it is not suitable for human consumption. But there's a guy called Michael somebody who has a website or a site called The Vortex, and he is a far right, homophobic, misogynist, anti-Francis guy. But even, I think LifeSite News has moved into a strong nationalist, anti-immigrant, anti-Francis space, and all this Catholic media is headed in this direction, and Bannon is looking to build that. And so, do you see a movement wherein the Catholic Church, after this brief foray into a more pastoral style of leadership, because Francis hasn't changed doctrine in anything, he's simply saying, you know, we've got to love gay people, you know, which is exactly, you know, crazy, that it may lurch to the right because of what Burke and Bannon are doing.
Short answer, yes. I have no trouble imagining that. I have no trouble seeing, because we've got models of where Christianity, not say the Catholic Church necessarily, but where Christianity gets harnessed into a mission like that. And you need only look at the influence of the American-style evangelical churches in that country. You know, that, and the whole, you know, that, and I don't want to call it religion, I want to call it an ideology. Right. You know, the Jesus wants you to make money, you know, as much money as possible. There's a term for that. I can't.
Prosperity gospel.
The prosperity gospel end of things.
Yeah. And
these distortions of the gospel message. And who am I to say? You're the theologian. You know, I'm the law professor, but there are such obvious distortions of the gospel message. And that's the part that Bannon and his cronies want to take hold of and harness, I think. My own feeling about our institutional church is that it will fall in on itself before it actually becomes a real factor, based on other things you and I have discussed, like the abuse scandal, and, you know, terrible things that are happening, and the way the place is institutionally fractured from inside. But that danger is there. I would say that danger is real.
Right. Fantastic. Rob, you have, I think, helped to soothe and to overcome that 1% of my mind, which was flirting with the sort of taking this in a more nuanced direction. I agree with what you said. You made your points extremely coherently, and I think it's been very helpful to me, and I hope it's been helpful to our audience, who I'm sure have their own strong views on Steve Bannon and on the forces that he is behind. So, Professor Rob Currie, Schulich professor at the Schulich School of Law at Dalhousie University, and world famous musician.